Much for tuning in today. My name is Sarah Cornish, and I am the Senior Director of Programs at Games for Change. If you don't know us yet, Games for Change is a nonprofit. We support game developers and social innovators who are making games that drive real-world impact, whether that's in health, civics, or education. We are so pleased today to welcome you to our live Industry Circle question and answer session with Schell Games, a member of our 2016 Industry Circle program. Today we have Principal Designer Sabrina Silba from Schell to talk about their Transformational Games framework. Sabrina will be calling in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We'll be running a Q&A using both the YouTube chat tool, which is located on the upper right corner of your screen, as well as Twitter. And you can follow along using hashtag G4C Industry and ask questions on Twitter as well. So as a quick introduction to the Industry Circle, our program is in its second year, and the Industry Circle initiative highlights companies and entrepreneurs who are emerging as leaders in the impact games sector. By sharing their methods, best practices, and lessons learned, we hope to really inspire others in our growing impact games community. The 2016 Industry Circle also includes Brain Pop, Filament Games, and Playmatics, and we had a Playmatics Q&A on YouTube about a month ago. So we're excited today to welcome Schell Games. Schell is a full-service game design and development company in Pittsburgh, founded in 2002. Schell makes transformational games, and you'll learn what that means a little later, that change people for the better. And their really awesome portfolio includes mobile, VR, online, console, casual games, social games, even some theme park attractions and connected toys. So I'm so excited to introduce Sabrina, and again, please be thinking up some good questions for her. We've got a couple already that have been submitted from our attendees, and we welcome more from the live audience. So thank you so much, Sabrina. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Sabrina Silba. I'm from Schell Games. As Sarah mentioned, we're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we work on a really wide variety of different games. And I'm going to talk to you today about a process that we use when we work on transformational games that we call the Transformational Framework. And we use that process to help prepare our teams to work with our clients and partners and make better games and make better player experiences. I'm going to use the term transformational quite a bit today, and I want to talk really briefly about what that means. When we use the term here at the studio, that's an umbrella term that can apply to games for health, educational games, serious games, games for change, impact games, empathy games. If your goal is to change the player, that we consider that a transformational game. And going a little bit further into some 3 criteria that we use for transformational games. Our goal is not just to change the player, but to change the player in a way that manifests itself in the real world. And be able to see that change when they're not playing the game anymore. And that includes persistence. So we want to see that change if they finish playing the game and they're never coming back. We want to see that change, and usually want to see that change as long as possible. And then the third part of a transformational game is it's an intentional change. We have a specific way that we want to change the player, and hopefully we achieve that specific change. And we started out as a studio, not really working on transformational games. We really began as an entertainment studio. Originally, we did most of our work for the Walt Disney Company, and over the years, we've expanded and done a lot of different types of projects. And about 7 years ago, we started working on transformational games, games intended to change players. And when we started that process, we really didn't have an initial new process for doing those games versus entertainment games. We were kind of doing our entertainment game process with learning goals added to it, right? And as we started doing those projects, we would run into issues. We'd run into mismatches of expectation and assumptions between our clients and our experts and our other stakeholder partners. Frustrations on our teams with team members who felt like they couldn't contribute to the game because they weren't sure about the subject matter that we were making a game on. They weren't sure what was highest priority. We had issues with a tension between fun and transformational, and wondering how does that guide how decisions are being made. And what we realized for those projects is that we would spend a lot of time early on talking about the game, talking about what kind of game do we want to make to achieve our purpose, but we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the problem space, talking about what was the problem we were actually trying to solve. If you take making a game off the table and you just focus on what is the issue that we're trying to solve and what can we learn from what other people have done or researched about this issue, we didn't spend a lot of time in that space. And sometimes we're partnering with experts who already kind of have that background, but we weren't spending enough time getting that information from them and getting our team to understand that. And so we started iterating on a different kind of process where we would spend more time digging into the problem space, really trying to understand it. And I like to think of this as, if you think of game development as a journey where you're going to climb a very difficult mountain, an arduous journey. Sometimes teams don't even make it to the top. What the transformational framework really is it's pausing at the base of the mountain, sort of setting up base camp and stopping to collect wisdom. And that wisdom comes from outcomes from outside the team, and it also comes from your stakeholders and partners. And the benefit of this really is to define a shared vision of the problem you're trying to solve, and to do that in partnership with all the stakeholders that are involved in the game that you're trying to make. So that's one big benefit from doing this process. And another big benefit that we've realized over time is that this is a great relationship building exercise. When you work on transformational games, you're working with very diverse teams across subject matter disciplines, sometimes teaching disciplines, and of course your game development team. Those folks all have different experiences, different expertise, and a lot of times they speak different languages and have different points of reference and different worldviews about different parts of the project that you'll be building. Creating your framework together and digging into their problem space together, that's a chance to really build that collaborative relationship, to learn each other's language, to be able to bridge those vocabulary differences, and to build trust. In any game project, as the game develops, you have to iterate. Things go wrong. You realize that great idea doesn't quite work in practice, or maybe there's a technical issue that's going to prevent you from executing it as well as you could, or there might be issues with resources, how much time or budget you have left, and you're going to need to make changes. And the benefit of doing a process like the Transformational Framework is you have a strong foundation to go back when you start to say, oh, our solution that we're currently building, it's not quite working. We can go back to that shared problem that we defined together to figure out how our approach to the solution is going to change. And we've built a relationship of trust with one another where we all feel like we understand our ultimate goal. And so we can maybe agree together on what change, what will shift. Maybe we said we were going to deliver this feature. We can all see that feature's not hitting our goals. We need to redirect, we need to change. So those are some of the benefits that we've seen of developing this process. And my goal today is really to try to share at a high level the pieces of the process with the intent that other people who are out there who are working on transformational games, whether you've made games before of this sort or you're thinking about doing it for the first time, to give you our template and to have you try to apply that and use that and see how you can adopt it and adapt it to what works for your project. And along that vein, we've shared, if you look down underneath the YouTube video, there's a link to a Google Drive folder where I've shared some of the handouts that I've used in workshops for students and other folks for training them on the Transformational Framework. So you're welcome to look at those. And as I talk through things, I might bring up a couple of images just to share. In fact, let me real quick bring up some. So when we talk about the Transformational Framework, this is really what the framework is. It's 8 topics that we spend time wrestling with in order to better and more deeply understand the problem space that we're working within. And this is very intentionally presented as a circle, a sort of web, interconnected web, because this isn't a linear process where we start with one piece and then we just move point through the pieces. Each of these pieces is interconnected. Sometimes you come in with one of these being set as a constraint where you already know it, and the other pieces need to be discovered and figured out. And one other point I want to make about this process is this isn't a perfect cure-all pill for all issues and problems that might come up on your project. So Doing this process isn't a guarantee that you're going to make a great game and going to be successful with that game. But and also, this isn't meant to be a rigid process. This really is meant to be something that you adapt and apply to projects differently depending on that project's needs. So it's not meant as a do it this way and you're doing it right and everything will be perfect. But it does, from what we've seen, it helps prepare teams to have a better relationship with clients, to feel more confident in how they're trying to solve their problem, and to react better to changes and challenges that come up on these kinds of projects. So I'm going to talk about the 8 pieces, and then we'll have some time for some questions and comments. So one of the first pieces that we talk about with teams is high-level purpose. And this is something that most teams kind of have a sense that they should have coming in. But one of the important things is to make sure that everybody really agrees on a succinct way of expressing your purpose. Whether you talk to key stakeholders or members of the development team, everybody's on the same page about what that purpose is. And that purpose, we found, really shouldn't be to make a game. Your purpose is to create a change in the world. It's not what you're doing, it's why you're doing it. And it's not the end point from which you leap off into development. A lot of times teams will come in with their purpose and immediately start developing. And what we've seen is that's the starting point, that's the foundation. And ideally, that's the thing that will not shift at all. Other pieces of your framework, other pieces of the game that you develop may change and iterate through development. Purpose should be foundational. It should be something that is always constant, that then you can go back to. The other thing, the next piece of the framework is audience and context. So audience is something that we talk about in traditional games. But usually we're talking about demographics and maybe play style or genre. So we might say something like 30 to 35-year-old women who play casual mobile games, or 12 to 14-year-old boys, or 6 to 8-year-olds. For transformational games, we've really found it's important to dig in deeper, because it's not just about defining the player as they come in as a player audience. It's also thinking about their relationship to the subject matter. So what do they already know or not know? How do they feel about the subject matter? The social network that surrounds them, what do they get from that social network along the lines of the subject matter? Also thinking about how that audience is going to access the game. When we talk about context, one of the things we think about is where and when are they going to access that game, and how is it going to impact how transformed they're going to be by our game. How long do they need to be exposed to that game, and how often for us to believe that this audience is going to be changed in the way that we want. And one of the benefits of digging into the audience is it leads really nicely into the next piece of the framework, which for me is the most important piece. And we call it barriers, and it's really this fundamental question of why aren't players already changed? Usually we're not tackling a brand new problem. We're tackling something that other people have tried to tackle through different interventions. And the question we want to ask is, what's standing in the way, particularly for our particular audience? Why aren't they already changed? Sometimes those answers aren't obvious or aren't what you expect. When we worked on the World of Lexica game, for example, which was a tablet game that had a high-level purpose of getting middle schoolers to become lifelong readers. One of our questions was, well, why aren't middle schoolers interested in reading? And there's a lot of sort of off-the-cuff theorizing that middle schoolers don't think reading is that fun, it's not that cool. They have a lot of other media that fights for attention. But one of the things that we learned digging into the research is that accessibility to books and time and space for reading makes a huge difference if people become lifelong readers. So I think digging into barriers can really help you understand your problem. And as a designer, I like barriers a lot because they're the tension in your problem space. And so they're great fodder for thinking about mechanics for your game and themes for your game. The next piece is player transformations. And this is really specifically how do we want to change players. And when we started working on these kinds of games, we talked about learning goals. And I think a lot of times when you look at learning goals, they're sort of written sort of very similarly to standards. So it's a lot of players will know this, or players will be able to do this. And the more of these games that we've worked on, the more we realized that there were other ways to transform players. And sometimes those things are more foundational to creating a change, especially if you're looking for a long-term change that really transfers into the player's personal life. So things like disposition, how do people feel about things, creating anecdotal experiences that players can think back on and reference to help drive the decision-making process, or thinking about the relationships with other people. It's not just the player that you're thinking about, but potentially their relationship to authority figures or to their social network. That can influence how much they're changed by your game. And so we talk about different ways of transforming players, different sort of categories of transforming players when we start projects. And usually we end up picking a number of transformations that that feed into each other as a sort of a web of transformation. So they support each other. So we might want to, for example, if you want to get kids to eat healthier, yeah, you can teach them what foods are healthy, but maybe you need to change need to help them build an identity as someone who eats healthy and cares about their body, as an example. The next piece of the framework is export resources. And this is a really, in my mind, vital piece to any project, especially if your team doesn't have expertise in the subject matter. You definitely want to have an expert on board. And I think the most common mistakes we see in this area is not bringing an expert on board early enough, because that expert's going to point you to all different references and resources that you can use, not only to complete your transformational framework and finish exploring this problem space, but also to help you think about that problem in a deep way. A lot of times experts have a lot of deep experience with your problem space. One of the things that our team struggled with experts is how to use them on the team. And so we've developed sort of categories of relationships with experts where we talk about how frequently we're going to meet with them. Are they going to be kind of an on-demand resource, or are they going to be somebody that has regular meetings with the team? Are they going to have any approval? Are they going to create any content? Those are all important questions in defining the relationship. Following expert resources, we have key concepts. So key concepts is the last piece of the framework that we added to it. And key concepts is really about thinking about the scope of your game. What's going to be in and or out in terms of your subject matter. A lot of times you talk about when we make these games, we're talking about a fairly broad subject. We might be making a game to teach middle schoolers chemistry, for example. Well, that's a big topic. And we're probably not going to be able to build enough mechanics and enough systems in our game to really give you gameplay that's going to help you understand all the different pieces and nuances of chemistry. So we have to make calls about what's in, what's out. And the other way that we use key concepts to talk about our subject matter space is to think about what's core, what's really important. If the player only remembers 3 things from the entire game experience, what are the really critical 3 things? Those things are going to become patterns and themes for our game. They're going to become things that are incorporated into multiple mechanics systems from our game. They might be themes in the content. And then we'll also have peripheral content. So content that if players see, great, it will support, what's the core content is, what the core concepts are. But if they miss it, that's okay too. And players will sometimes, miss content. The next piece is supporting research. And there are really 2 components to supporting research. One component is what you might think of when you hear the term research. So formal research that could be on your subject matter specifically. Like it could be research on how specifically kids learn physics or struggle with physics, or it could be more general research into learning theory or player motivation or behavior change. And then the other part of supporting research is prior work, and we include in that not just other games that have maybe tried to tackle your problem before, but other types of interventions that have tried to change people along the lines that you're trying. So looking at those and seeing what's successful, what's not successful, why do people think they've been successful, even looking at games that have achieved change, but maybe they weren't designed to achieve change, but other people talk about they have an impact on players in a certain way, and what can we learn from those games and apply them so that we can get intentional change in our game along the same lines. And then the last piece is assessment plan. And it's really important to talk about this up front, because if you don't, you kind of end up with, well, what can we find out about the player and how well the player is doing? Analytics. And analytics can be useful, but analytics for games is really oriented around how well is the player doing within the game system. How far are they? How long did it take them to do this? How much have they done that? And that doesn't necessarily tell you that the player's been transformed. Exposure to content in your game is not a guarantee that they've been transformed. And often for some of the more complex problems that we try to tackle with transformational games, it doesn't give you a lot of insight especially if you're talking about things like disposition or behavior. Those things often can't be tracked in the game, and particularly if you're looking for behavior change outside of the game context. So you need to think about with your partners, what are you really going to look at, and how are you going to get that information for determining if your game is effective. So this is important for development and your claims about what the game can do. And then also for games that are going to be used for other people to get assessment either on themselves or on students, for example, how is the game going to assess players and then share that assessment in a way that's useful to either the player themselves or a teacher. So talking about those upfront with our partners helps us establish our expectation for how we might go about assessment, and also figure out if there are any contingencies or dependencies we need to be aware of in terms of if there's going to be a study. Do we need to have a version of the game done by a certain time? How are they going to get information? Are they going to have a pre-survey, a post-survey? So trying to get some of those questions out there, out in the open, and have the team understand that and be able to work that into the production schedule. So that's a real quick overview of all the different pieces of the framework, and I can talk a little more deeply about some of the specific ones if there are specific questions on them, or we can do more general questions. I did want to mention that we are working on a book as a sort of guide for teams who want to use the transformational framework. And if you are interested in being notified via email when that book comes out, in the Google folder with the worksheets and handouts that we shared, there's also a form where you can sign up and just give us your email address, and we'll send you a message when it's available.
Great. Thank you so much, Sabrina. So this is Sarah from Games for Change, the voice of God right now. So we're going to have a short Q&A session. We've been getting some really great questions coming in from the YouTube chat. So if you think of more as Sabrina's answering the existing questions, please go ahead and type those in. We've also been collecting some questions from Twitter and from email. So I'm going to start with a question from Jillian Morrison from Swinburne University, and then we'll move on to the next couple of questions. So Jillian asks, when you discuss an assessment plan in line with the transformational framework, what do you find that your collaborators are most interested to learn? So specifically around the assessment plan.
So it depends on what it is that we're trying to change for the player, but a lot of times for more concrete subjects, the question is, can the player, can the individual demonstrate mastery over something outside the game context, where they're actually going to have to use it in the real world. That's I think one of the most common types of questions that we get asked in terms of assessment. Another question that is relevant for teachers that, and this is not necessarily for development, but for the usefulness of a game in the classroom, is where are students struggling, and when are students making those leaps forward. And that's another question that sometimes we can't necessarily, sometimes we have to really think deeply about how do we surface that in the game? How can we make the game a tool for our teachers to use to get a window into what students are learning?
Okay, awesome, thank you. So Zach, who is here with us in our YouTube chat, asks if you use a specific development methodology. So for example, Agile or Waterfall, in your processes at Schell with your team.
Yeah, we use Agile here at Schell, and we do sprint-based development. I think with games, you really need an iterative development process that can respond to what you're learning as you move forward. So that process worked really well for us.
Okay, makes sense. Another question. This one is from Marianne Perez de Francias from Cipala Labs. Not sure where Marianne's from, but she asks, how do you track behavior change in a transformational game? What tracking mechanisms and metrics should we build into our design?
Well, I think, as I was saying before, analytics is the easiest thing to add into games themselves. And so the answer to your question is actually a little bit about what you need to build outside the game, and that doesn't necessarily have to be done through technology, but it needs to be you need to have access to players before they play to understand where are they coming from, what it was their starting point if you're going to show change, and then access to players afterwards. And so that could be a paper survey, that could be an interview, that could be some kind of task that you're asking them to do. One of the unfortunate things is that costs a lot of money, and best practices to that to do that often involve working with researchers, which costs money and takes time. And so that's why I think you see a lot of games don't get a chance to do that as rigorously as they might like. It's difficult, and it's pretty resource intensive.
Okay, thanks. Next one is from Patty Umali on Twitter, and she asks, do you think identifying too wide of an age or audience range creates too many barriers? How can the game's design overcome that?
Yes, I do. I think there is if I were going to give feedback or advice to potential clients, one of the things that I think developers want you to know is that everyone is not a target audience. If you say that you want your game to be playable for everyone, that's great. But what we really want, what really help us as designers, what really helps us is constraints. And especially when we're talking about kids, the difference between a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, the difference between a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, those are big developmental leaps. And so it's very beneficial to your team and to your ultimate goal, I think, to be as specific as you can be. The other reason is, and there's lots of reasons for that. One is, just the level at which you're going to present the content, and the kinds of, any kind of narrative that you have, making that narrative relevant and appropriate for the audience. Even things like conventions for interfaces. When we design games for preschoolers, done a number of them with Fred Rogers, working on a couple of different of their properties, PBS properties. We have to think about, well, conventions that would work for adults just straight out the gate don't necessarily work for young children. And if we are designing for an 8-year-old, we could totally use that convention because they've seen it. They've played a lot of these games. If you're designing for a 3-year-old, we might need to think about what's going to be intuitive. If you hadn't played, maybe this is your first tablet game ever. So you might not be aware of those conventions or be able to understand them visually.
Okay, great, thanks. Jean-Michel Blatier, who is from Games for Change Europe, and he runs our Europe Festival. And Jean-Michel asks to hear your thoughts on virtual reality for impact. Is there a transformational VR world that you're exploring? At Games for Change, we're really excited about the potential of VR for social change and learning. And I know you're doing some really exciting work at Schell. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, most of the VR work that we've done so far has not been transformational in nature. We did have a really cool VR project that's currently going for its second round of funding that is about chemistry and uses VR. I think VR has a ton of potential for transformation. I think and that for a lot of reasons. I think the emotional impact and the presence impact and the ability to step inside a simulation and to experiment just amps up what games already does for learning to, I think, another level. And I know there are other people who feel that way. In fact, there's a VR for impact call out from the UN asking for people to think about how we can use VR to really transform the world and achieve some of the sustainable development goals. So there are a lot of people out there thinking, kind of eyeing VR as a really strong potential avenue for transforming players and really connecting to players in a whole new way. So I'm pretty excited about it, and so is our studio.
Great, thank you. Okay, Andrea Jones asks, can you say more about how educational goals fit into the transformation part of the framework? Do you still have goals that aim for ability to regurgitate facts, or have you completely abandoned that aim?
No, we haven't completely abandoned it. Let me see if I can bring up our list of different types of transformation. So knowledge transformation, that's what I would consider anything that's sort of fact-based, the ability to maybe recall a piece of vocabulary or to make a factual statement about something. That's a totally valid way of transforming players, and definitely something that we have in a lot of our games. Often knowledge is a key component to transforming people or convincing people of a mindset shift. Let me see if I can share this. This is in that folder. that we're sharing with everyone, and that link underneath the YouTube video. So we definitely consider knowledge, but we also consider looking at you can take your learning goals and look at the learning goals and think about, if you want the player to be able to do that, or if I want the player to demonstrate that, maybe what are other types of transformations for the player that need to happen in order for them to actually demonstrate that. Because you can tell someone something, but if they're not intrinsically motivated to do it, then if you take the camera off them, they may no longer perform that action or that behavior. So we can't just talk about telling people something. We really need to think about, how do we transform what their disposition towards something is, or their belief, their sense of truth, or their sense of identity, who they are, what's important to them. So we use this list not as a hard and fast list of these are the only ways that you can transform people, because there's a lot of overlap between these, even within our team. So we debate, is this a skill thing, or is this a disposition or behavior thing? But as a jumping off point to think a little more broadly in a little more nuanced way about how we could transform players. It's not just about skill, it's not just about knowledge. I think teams focus on that because that's what school focuses on. And so I think a lot of times we get stuck in that pattern of, it's about memorizing facts or being able to replicate a process. But I think there's many more ways that we can use our medium to transform individuals.
Right, great, thank you. All right, this is just rapid fire. So here's another one, Sabrina. This question is from Petty Van Recom from the League of Women Voters out in California. And Petty asks, in order to seek funding for the development of a game for change, can you please describe what the costs would be? So can you talk a little bit about funding and budget for these kinds of transformational games?
Yeah, I would say they're underfunded in general. So if you're trying to fundraise for a game, I just want to offer you my support and encourage you to stick with it. There are opportunities for funding. I think we've had some luck as a studio going after SBIR grants, and sometimes we have partners who come to us and they have some funding. Work with them. In terms of scale of funding, I think sometimes if people are coming from outside of games, or maybe they're a nonprofit who's thinking maybe a game would help us spread our message or achieve our goals, they might be surprised at the costs. I think you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars at the minimum, not tens of thousands of dollars typically. And the other thing, I think one piece of that budget that sometimes folks don't realize is that marketing matters a lot. And as much as you spend on the game, if you really want to spread your game or have your game be a commercial success, if that's part of the important set of goals for you, then marketing budget is another piece of it. And then I was talking earlier about assessment, and how a lot of times assessment involves, humans talking to your players outside of your game and following them over time. That stuff is expensive. And so thinking about your research budget, do you need to do any kind of rigorous assessment, and who's going to do that? That's another important component to consider when you're working on these kinds of games.
Okay, thank you. All right, next one, Carlos Ramirez asks, he says, I'm trying to make my interfaces friendly for people with different conditions. So for example, folks with visual impairments or specific mental health conditions. Is this something, Sabrina, that you can talk to a little bit? He asks how he can sort of address these things in his games, and specifically his game interface.
I'm not an expert in those things. I think there are resources out there for general accessibility that might be good sources to look at. And then if you are dealing specifically with a particular audience, I would really encourage you to partner with a subject matter expert for that audience, someone who works with that audience, maybe someone who is able to speak specifically to how the audience interacts with digital media.
Yeah, and this is Sarah from Games for Change. We featured an organization called Able Gamers at last year's Games for Change Festival. They ran a terrific workshop on designing accessible games. And so I would encourage you, Carlos, to check out that talk and Able Gamers. All right, so next one. Dan Norton, hey Dan from Filament Games, asks, could you talk a bit more about the difference between expert resources and supporting research?
Sure. Expert resources typically, for us, is typically, at least in part, a person, so a real human being that you can interact with and have a dialogue about your the issue and the game as it develops. Sometimes we do use papers and our books or other sources for our expert resources in tandem with individual experts, but it's usually very specifically on the problem we're trying to solve and the way we're trying to transform players. We use supporting research more as more foundationally. So a lot of times the supporting research that we're referencing is applicable across lots of different games. I know we have referenced quite a bit self-determination theory and growth mindset when we work on these kinds of games. So if you're a game developer working on transformational games and you aren't familiar with those two things, I definitely encourage you to go look them up, because I think they're broadly applicable to designing games for transformation. And then also, we, like I mentioned, we look at prior work as part of our supporting research. So what have other people done that we can learn from and build from or point to as why we're making decisions, or what we might try in our game.
Okay, thanks. All right, next set of questions is from Adam Wolf from Indiana University's Informatics Department. And Adam asks, and I think Sabrina, we shared this question with you earlier, in the course of your research, have you found that people respond with greater willingness or enthusiasm to the idea of transformation being openly acknowledged, as in a game clearly intended to help the user lose weight or quit smoking, or instead when the game is presented under another pretext? So, and then he follows up with a question about whether or not the sort of transformational reason for playing affects the engagement of the player. So the amount of time a user chooses to play, or sort of the depth to which they play. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is one of those foundational design questions that projects have to make a decision on pretty early, which is, are you going for what you might call the head fake, where you play the game because you just want to play the game, but as it turns out, you're learning something, surprise, or we've changed your mind about something, surprise, or a number of different ways we can try to change you. Or should we invite you into that process and tell you this is a game about X, and playing this game is going to help you do X? And I think one of the questions we have to answer, there are two pieces. One is we're looking, and this is really about motivation for the player, right? Is the player trying to change themselves? Are they intrinsically motivated to achieve this change? If so, it might make sense to tap into their desire to be changed, because that's going to align with their sense of identity, and it might help support their interaction with the game and their attention to the game. And another thing you have to look at is a source of authority, and if the player is going to be excited about a source of authority telling them that they should play this game, or if that's going to be a turnoff. And I think you see that issue in schools. Sometimes you run into issues where students assume, that a game might not be fun or might not be enjoyable or isn't worth doing because they're being kind of forced outside of their own volition to do the game. Another interesting angle on that I've seen, and there's some research to support, is actually sort of an in-between, where you have the player play as someone who's helping another character or another person achieve the change. And it sounds a little bit strange, but there is some research that shows that putting the player in the role of a teacher can actually get them to engage a little more deeply in the content. So that's another angle on that question of, are you going for a head fake, or are you going to be absolutely transparent?
Great, that's fascinating. Thank you. All right, Adam Hughes from Indiana University also asks if there are ethical concerns or considerations that you creating transformational games, like maybe trying to make the users feel a certain way or change behavior. So can you talk a little bit about ethics?
Yes, I think it's important to consider, why your motivation and what your ultimate goal is when you are making these games. In theory, this power could be used for evil and ill. If you can change people to eat more healthily, could you also change people to believe something that's totally not true? we at Schell Games, our philosophy is that we make games what we like with people we like to make the world a better place. And we try to use that lens on our projects and believe that the change that we're trying to achieve is the change that is beneficial to both our individual players and to the world as a whole. And I think that's important for any creator in any medium to think about what's going to be the impact of the influence of my medium or my particular creation.
Great. All right, we have time for about 3 or 4 more questions, which we have already collected from YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for being so engaged and for such great questions. So the user Sparrowbird2006 asks, how do you map game mechanics to your transformational outcomes and vice versa? What does that process look like?
Yeah, we have different ways of doing that. One of my favorite ways of doing that is when you're building your design documents for your systems and thinking about your theoretically, I mean, what it really comes down to is your designers and your teams thinking about, okay, we need the player to be transformed in this way, and we have to have a system that has this key concept embedded into it. You know, here's our design for what we think is going to convey that key concept, and it's going to have this impact, and it's going to help players overcome this barrier. I really recommend that teams put front and center on a game system, what that game system theoretically contributes to the transformational goals, so that you keep a record of the connection. This is really your theory about how your design is a response to the problem space that you've defined. And I think one of the benefits of doing that is that when you have to cut systems or change systems, you can have a conversation about, well, what's the impact going to be, not just to the game experience or to our budget or our timeline, but also to the transformation. You know, this system was important because of X, Y, Z. If we take it out, are there other systems that are going to fill in the gap there, or is this going to be a pretty big hit on how we think that we're going to successfully transform players?
Great, thank you. All right, a couple more. Sabrina, you're doing great. Thank you so much. So we've got Kay Cleveland asking, when you get multiple content experts together to build a framework, do you find the group getting into the weeds with special minutia? How do you keep the group from going down rabbit holes and focused on the task at hand?
Yeah, that can happen. I don't think we typically have, 5 or 6 subject matter experts. Usually we have 1, maybe 2 people that we're interacting with. But I know one thing that I've realized is that almost every discipline, has its perspectives and sort of theoretical camps of how to approach something or what's most important. And so you will run into differences of opinion about, what's most important to include on this subject, or how should this be taught, or those kinds of questions. That's why having a hierarchical structure is important. I think those conversations, while they might seem difficult, it is, if you're having one of those and it's early in the process, you're doing something right, because you're going to have those conversations will come up later if you don't have them now. So have them now, hash out, the approach that you're going to take on your game. And I think acknowledging that just because you take an approach in your game, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying that's the only right answer, but you kind of have to make decisions about what approach you're going to take for your subject and what is going to be important for your game specifically. And agree upon that. Not everyone has to agree that that's what they would have chosen personally, but it is a collaborative effort. I think it's really important to have those conversations and to recognize that having those disagreements is not a problem. It's just failing to have them just because they're difficult. I think that's the problem.
Makes sense. Thank you. All right, last question. Thank you all for tuning in. We've got Mike Barwise asking, how do you deal with trying to affect transformation on a topic to an audience that doesn't fully understand it? And he cites the example of young audiences who might not be fully aware of the subject matter.
I think that's a pretty broad question. I mean, that is a problem. Complexity is one of the types of barriers. Complexity and difficulty is one of the types of barriers that we see in working on these kinds of games. Actually, let me quickly bring up our barrier list, because I think that might be useful for folks to see. This again is in the folder that we've shared with everybody. There's sort of similar to transformations, we talk about barriers and I would consider this to be examples of barriers. We're not necessarily talking about this list that you'll see up here isn't a hard and fast list of these are the only types of barriers that exist and they don't overlap at all. But we use this as a jumping off point to think about our problem space and to think about what could be standing in the way, especially for our particular audience. Sometimes for very young children, a different tact that I've seen for these kinds of, for very complex topics is to maybe go with metaphor and maybe also figure out exactly what's the most important high-level take that you feel like you really need to hit with your game. So as a personal example, I worked on a version of our Happy Atoms, our Schell Games Happy Atoms project. If you're not familiar with that, the Happy Atoms product from Schell Games is the physical molecule set that's paired with a tablet game that will let you build molecules and sort of explore chemistry through a game-like experience. And that's targeted at middle school kids, older kids. And this little side project that I worked on was how can we take something that's inspired by that, but is targeted at preschool kids, right? Kids who are 2 to 3, so very, very young. And we really focused at a very high level, simplified concept of chemistry. We took molecules out of it. We took anything about formulas out of it. It was just this idea that the world around you, every object around you is made up of tiny things called atoms, and that there are different types of atoms. So those were our 2 things. So we weren't going for them to master chemistry. And then as a peripheral to that, we were going to say the names of the different types of atoms in the game. And so through that, you could get kids, what we saw, kids repeating those names. So they were kind of becoming familiar with the language of the space. And the idea there was really to sort of seed comfort with the topic so that when kids next encounter chemistry, those ideas aren't totally new. Those ideas aren't coming out of the blue, but they're a little more familiar. They're a little more, they're a little less intimidating, and not really to teach them chemistry, but to prepare them to learn chemistry.
Great. Sabrina, thank you so much for your time. Again, this is Sabrina, the principal designer at Schell Games. We are so glad for your insights, and I think this was an incredibly helpful session for all of the folks who've tuned in, developers and educators and more. So thank you. And to everyone who tuned in today, thank you very much. Thanks for your great questions. Hopefully you learned some useful advice that you can bring into your game projects at your own companies. So just wanted to let you know that we will be conducting several more of these YouTube live sessions with our other Industry Circle members over the coming months. So stay tuned. And you can learn more about the work of Schell Games at their website, schellgames.com. And finally, a plug for the Games for Change Festival. You can save the date for July 31st and August 1st. In New York City, we'll be bringing folks like Sabrina and Schell Games together for an exciting 2-day conference around games for impact and learning. So thanks again, everyone. And this recorded, the recorded session will actually be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And so if you tuned in late or had to leave early, no problem at all. You can watch the full session on YouTube. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye.